This is lecture 2 in the Western intellectual tradition from Erasmus to George Grant. I want to look at this lecture, the 16th century Crossroads, then and now. One of the reasons we reflect on the past is that there's nothing new under the sun. Like a great drama, whether a Shakespeare or Aeschylus or Sophocles or a Goethe or Marlowe, or even a Nietzsche, Eternal Return, Myth of the Eternal Return, there are certain themes that perpetually recycle in history, and we can see them played out again and again, and the script, whether it's comedic or comedic tragic or tragic comedic, it remains the same. Different actors play the parts. Certain actors come on stage within the drama of history. As Shakespeare would say, all the world's a stage and men and women merely players. We have our entrances, we have our exits, and throughout the history of thought, different women and men come on the stage. They play their parts, inevitably, in the world of politics. They die, they leave the stage, but the script remains the same, and new people come on the stage, as it were. They internalize, they read the script, they act out their role, then their time under the sun ends, and other people come on the stage and play their role. And so one of the key aspects of understanding the history of political thought and intellectual thought and religious thought, literary thought, is to recognize that history is perpetually recycling itself. And so we can see, gratefully so, if we're rooted and grounded in history at its best, the consequences of decisions made in people's personal lives, their relational lives, their friendship lives, family lives, community lives, and the consequences of making certain decisions. And once we realize this decision leads to this consequence, which takes us to a cliff's edge. Do you want to go to the cliff's edge? Well, then rethink the decisions that are being made, because this is the inevitable trajectory of a certain type of decision. And in that sense, the 16th century is very important for us now, who live, again, in the midst of political tensions, where we get, on the one hand, the progressives holding high important elements of what they see as cultural Marxism and postmodern thought and social justice warriors and woke, and those who differ with them, they turn on them what Nietzsche would call like Feuerhunds or firehounds. They breathe fire on them. And then you get the reactionary right arguing against what they see the narrow-mindedness of the progressive left that silences, cancels, platforms are abolished based on how people are interpreting hot-button issues. And so the reactionary right, even though the content in the reactionary right is the opposite of the progressive left, what they both share is a tendency to demonize one another, to turn on one another, to cancel one another out, either rhetorically, or worse yet, when you follow down that path, it can lead to, well, obviously the breaking of relationships and friendships, the reductio ad absurdum, if you go further down, that leads to, obviously, the use of violence, where people differ, they can't seem to hear one another, they can't seem to agree. So you get a toxic, poisonous culture in which people are like rams in rutting season, and of course that undermines any sense of civility or respect, or how one engages conflict, how one engages differences. And then, of course, many people, when they hit conflict or difficulty, they either get into the fight, the charge, or the flight mode, because they see where this is going. They can't identify with either tribe in the heated culture wars. So they're like deers, they run up into the forest and hide in the forest, far from the fray, which of course then just facilitates such clashes. Now the 16th century, in that sense, as is every century and most decades, are fraught with intense culture wars and clashes, and I just want to look at a few of these in the late 15th and early 16th century as we move forward in this. The first would be the Machiavelli, very, very important, and Erasmus. They look at, in one sense, there are two different approaches to politics. Often when we look at the history of political theory or political philosophy, the danger is going from someone like a Thomas Aquinas to Machiavelli, and then you move into Locke or Hobbes or Burke and then Mill, and fast forward into the late modern forms of liberalism. And so, but it's very important to set Erasmus and Thomas More beside Machiavelli, because they're in many ways are virtual contemporaries, late 15th century, early 16th century. Now Machiavelli, not only in The Prince, but his discourses on Livy and his many other writings, he's a much more sophisticated thinker than some who just put him at the level of crude political realism. Machiavelli, both in the Italy of his time, in Florence, he was in the midst. He was both an intellectual. Machiavelli knew that any minimally educated person in the 15th, early 16th century would have been grounded in the classics, Greek and Latin thought, and particularly as this played itself out politically. So Machiavelli was both an activist and an intellectual. You could have intellectuals who are not activists, and so they live in the tower of thought, but when asked, so what does this look like in the world of action, they're somewhat impotent and paralyzed. Then you can have activists who don't think a great deal, and they often do things which are quite regrettable in retrospect in terms of the carnage they leave behind, either in thought, word, or deed. Now Machiavelli was in the thick of the city-states wars in Italy at the time, particularly between the city-states, an attempt to unify Italy, the role of the church, the papacy. And so how is Italy to be run? And Machiavelli was at the center of that. And for him, what is the relationship of, in this case, the Catholic Church, obviously, in Rome, the city-states in Italy, and can Italy itself come together as a unified whole? And if so, what role would the church play in that, or oppose that in that sense? Machiavelli took the position that the renewal of culture at its best could work itself out through religious communities, called these unarmed prophets, who brought virtue, who brought insight, who brought spirituality to the life of the people. So two orders which had emerged just before Machiavelli were the Dominicans and Franciscans, and he saw in Dominic and the Dominicans, of which Aquinas came from, or Francis and the Franciscans. These were two renewal movements that in one sense embodied the way of Christ, and they led to and understood properly a meaningful renewal of culture, and through their in-depth spirituality they could play a substantive role in renewing culture. But there were limits, he also realized, in what the friars could accomplish, because Machiavelli had a very high role for the state and who had the power to bring changes. And at a certain role, the friars were limited. They were in many ways parapolitical groups that were very interested in renewal culture, but it was underneath the radar of the state. And Machiavelli argued, again, there were armed prophets, he would argue. And so how did the Jewish tradition begin? Well, it was an armed prophet, Moses. Moses was prepared to face the Pharaoh of his time, led a political movement outside of Egypt. And those who followed Moses were very much people who were willing to use the Joshua, the judges, in their battle with other states. So here it's religious fused then with violence and power. And they're the ones who brought meaningful change, Machiavelli will argue. Savonarola, great prophet of late medieval Italy, again, he's an unarmed prophet. So what amount of change can he bring beyond a voice that cries in the wilderness? There's limits. And then Machiavelli, as many in the late medieval period, early 16th century, saw was Islam a powerful force, and in that sense Muhammad. was the Muslim version of Moses, who was quite willing, from the Mecca, Medina back to Mecca, willing to use force and power. And so Muhammad became very much a model for many in the 16th century in terms of religion and politics. That was contrasted with the unarmed prophets. You have the armed prophets. But in Machiavelli's work on Livy and many of the Republican Romans, he argued very clearly, trying to apply Republican Rome to Florentine Italy, is that power is essential, but power that is backed up by force is equally important, just not the power of words and the power of insight and the power of truth, but also the power of implementing what one believes in. And so a voice that merely cries out against corruption, cries out for a better world, but cannot enforce anything, it becomes a crippled understanding of truth rather than a form of truth that can be embodied, but the word is articulated but can't be carried through into deed. And so there were obviously voluntary groups that would move from thought to deed, such as Dominicans and Franciscans, but in terms of impacting the center of power and the conflicts between the Borgias and many others, the city-states clashes in Italy, Machiavelli argued the state is very important in terms of these bigger issues, and he or she who knows how to use power properly will bring about the best results. And so for Machiavelli, the state was something he tended to focus on, hence his work on the Prince, but he wrote many other works drawing from Roman thought. And who were those in power? Those who didn't know how to use power properly, and the impact of that. But underneath a lot of Machiavelli's, right, so there's a layered way of Machiavelli approaches how power is understood, from unarmed prophets to armed prophets. What's the relationship merely to speech or word and action, and what's the relationship of action in a non-government way and action in a political way? One brings far greater, it can lead to violence, it can lead to brutality, or it can lead to stability. And so in Machiavelli's writings, there is this layered way of understanding, drawing from the past, drawing from religious thought. And his clashes, obviously, he hoped in time that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, it could be used to consolidate a unified Italy, and yet Rome and many of the popes tended to think more of as much as they had their interest in Italy, it was consolidating the power of the church. So the clash between the power of the church and the power of city-states and the republic itself, these were issues that Machiavelli was grappling with. But he did, by the end, argue that if the prince ever hopes to stay in power in a meaningful way, he has to know how to move the levers of people and power. And if you can appeal through virtue, through goodness, through diplomacy, yes, that is definitely the best way to go to consolidate power. But when all else fails, then how do you use people, play them off against one another to bring about the desired end, but know how to do it in a cunning, in a thoughtful way, that the end that you hope to attain will be attained. And so often principle becomes subordinated to power, or power becomes the dominating principle in Machiavelli in a fairly thoughtful and subtle way. And so here you get, as a contemporary of Erasmus, who I touched on earlier, Erasmus was concerned with the role of the state, and sometimes when we hear the word conservative today, we think of people lighter state, more power to the individual, more role of society, the voluntary sector, the creative initiative of people, which a state can undermine. Erasmus, like Machiavelli, shared a concern for the important role of the state and those women and men who are at high levels of the state in terms of their role in bringing about a good society. Both would share the concern, as many conservatives would today, for the voluntary sector, for society, for friendships, for community, for what we would call non-government organizations today, or government-assisted organizations. But they also believed that the locus of power was primarily in the state. This is where the finances were. This is where the military was. This is where the source of influence and decision-making was that had huge ripple effects for not only the state or the city one lived in, but in their case, obviously, the broader European theater of politics. Now, the difference between Machiavelli and Erasmus when it comes to the state, for Erasmus, is he wrote to many of the monarchs of his time and the princes of his time, and he wrote books on the education of princes and how a prince or a ruling princess, as it were, should be educated in not only their growing years in terms of how they should live, but how they should rule their states. And of course, Erasmus and Machiavelli lived at the end of the waning Holy Roman Empire as nation-states were emerging. But Erasmus took the position, as did Thomas More, who had a very high view of the state, being Lord Chancellor of England himself. He was an activist, Thomas More was, in a way Erasmus wasn't. But they saw the state at its best, recognizing power was there, but power was to be used in a positive way for justice and peacemaking, not just competing powers being weighed off one another, but in fact the role of the prince or the monarch was to embody the highest ideals of a Christian civilization, and hence their education and then the application of their education. And now some could argue that Erasmus was naive. His early involvement with Henry VIII in England, and then his letter to princes, the education of princes, that it's all right when they're teens and early 20s to give them this high, noble, lofty ideals for how they're to act, but once they get into power, they then become Machiavellian in the power politics of states. But you do have two different traditions emerging in this period of time. Sophisticated power politics of a Machiavellian variety, an idealistic role of politics of an Erasmian tradition. And in that sense, these two traditions collide. One leads to idealism in terms of the role of the state in politics. The other is the balancing of power politics, that you get more of a Machiavellian tradition. Second thing I'd like to note, which is very much with us today, is the rise of science and religion. And so you have the idealist view of politics and the realist, and the many, obviously, positions between that, of which Machiavelli and Erasmus are very much point in different paths in that sense. You get the issue of religion and politics. This is a period of time in which Copernicus is emerging. He's arguing very clearly, which Galileo will follow. Astronomy is developing, in which he argues that we don't live in a geocentric universe, but a heliocentric universe in which the Earth, as many other planets, go round the sun. Now, within elements of the Catholic tradition, certainly not all within the Catholic tradition, they took the position, a very literal read of certain verses in the Psalms, that the earth cannot be moved. So if you take a couple of verses from the Psalter in which the earth cannot be moved, the Psalms part of the Bible's the inspired word of God, then if you have astronomers coming along and arguing increasingly so that in fact the earth is moving at a rapid pace around the sun, who do you believe? The world of empiricism or the world of revealed religion of which the church embodied? So you're beginning to get, at this period of time, through Copernicus and then Galileo, more the 17th century, but Copernicus the 16th century, the emergence of the clash between religion and science in a form of religion, in this case the Roman Catholic tradition, that had, particularly those who were interpreting at this time, a literalist read in terms of what was to become the science of astronomy, drawn from a literalist read of the Bible and emergent science. And really for quite a few hundred years afterwards, there was this tension, and of course it feeds into the 19th century with the rise of evolution and Darwin, young Earth, old Earth. So this tension which is emerging in the 16th century, which is one way really a clash between scientism, as it moves on later, because science obviously is winning the day here with its empiricism and recognizing that in fact this is the reality. So you have a form of religiosity that totally is willing to not see, in fact, what the best empirical insights illuminate, and they're frozen into a superstitious read of a text. Now, obviously, there were members in the Roman Catholic Church, cardinals and others, which desisted with the Pope on treatments of Galileo and others. But the seeds of this clash, which have accelerated over the centuries between what was to become finally scientism and religiosity, and there's obviously a broad middle way between science and religion in which these work together, either in astronomy or biology, physics, and many other areas. But another crossroads which is opening up at this period of time. And then the last one I'll mention as I began this lecture is where and I've referred to this earlier, particularly the theological elements. So I touched on Machiavelli-Erasmus in terms of the political and the state, idealism and realism, religion and politics, the whole issue of elements of Tridentine Catholicism, and its treatment of certain scientists, Copernicus, but more importantly Galileo. The latter is the theological one, in which we see the culture wars very much played out in their intensity and clashes and tensions between Erasmus and Luther. Luther was absolutely convinced that his interpretation of the Bible and church tradition was right. He saw the Roman Catholic Church increasingly so as an evil, a great Babylon, a whore. The Pope was the Antichrist, and anyone who increasingly differed with them was cancelled. You already can see this. This is also a period of time of the Gutenberg press, so increasingly, just like these days with Twitter, this was an epoch of time when information could be transferred much, much quicker. People could be written about, dismissed, rhetorically turned on, and so the press was firing out all sorts of texts and manuscripts. It was the democratization of information, which we're of course getting today, and people could rhetorically erase, turn on, demonize others. And so Luther very much was an aggressive rhetorician in terms of through the use of language, undermining, demeaning. In many ways, some of the language that Luther uses would be comparable in the culture wars today to some of the Twitter things that people are saying, just in a more secularized manner, in terms of the way he dismissed those he disagrees with. They were either the devil, or you could squash them, like some of the things he said about Erasmus, for example. You look at that, the metaphor is used. This is no different than some of the demeaning things that people say to get to one another in the culture wars today, who they disagree with. And so the theological wars that took place in the early decades of the 16th century, and the language which was used, and the way people were dismissed and undermined, and the way they were treated rhetorically, and worse yet, obviously, some of the terrible violence which finally emerged in the religious wars of the late 16th century and 17th century are no different in many ways than what we see being played out today. So when people are somewhat offended by what they see as a trans-civic or trans-civil way of relating today, either parapolitical or at a formal political level to the south of us across the border, and they think this is something new. Well, not really. History is replete, whether the 16th, 17th century, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Civil War, this sort of language that if you follow down that further, history is very clear that that language, when translated into action, can lead to some disastrous and tragic consequences for one and all. And so when we look back on the past and see where that language takes us in thought, and then when it's applied in deed, not only in speech, but finally in the way people treat one another, we know the tragic consequences. So at a certain point, sign almost has to be held up and say, there be dragons there, or halt. Look at the past, where this goes. Look at the consequences. Do you want to go there? Does this lead to any way of a sane, a just, a civil society? No. So we may start looking at our heart, our heads, our hyper-reactionary issues, and there are those in the past who can say there is another path in terms of the crossroads that we can take if we have but eyes to see, and hearts that are soft and nimble, and minds that know how to think these issues in a much more shrewd and judicious manner. And so crossroads, there is the three I basically mentioned, the Machiavelli and Erasmian. As conservatives in one sense, they both had a high view of the state, a different view of the relationship of ideals, realism, and power, the relationship of science and religion, and then finally the relationship of how people engage one another, who they differ with, in this case at a religious level, but if we just secularize that, the way of thinking, the way of speaking, and the way of acting remains exactly the same. And so the ironical tradition of an Erasmus, in one sense, is an antidote to the toxins of the Lutheran approach that we merely see being played out today in the culture wars between the reactionary right and the ideological left.